Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on when you're listening to the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com Formula One podcast. My name is Balve Bains, and I'm joined by Asian correspondent Michael Butterworth and editorial director Dieter Rencken. Michael, it's so good to have you on the podcast again. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Balve. I've just got off the high-speed train from Shanghai, so it's a lovely day here in Beijing, and I'm looking forward to a Grand Prix that's somewhat in my time zone for a change this weekend.
That definitely always helps. Dieter, and I can't believe I'm saying this, you haven't travelled at all from the last time we spoke last week.
No, that's quite correct, Balve. Unusually so, and I won't be travelling Grand Prix-wise for a while because I'm not going to Australia. Our colleague Aaron Deckers is down there. And then, of course, the Chinese Grand Prix was cancelled. And Baku, again, is Aaron's turn. So my next Grand Prix appearance will be in Miami. But I do have an awful lot of travel packed into the period between now and Miami. You know, there's some rally stuff that I'm doing. There's the WEC race at Spa, my local circuit, 34 kilometers south of me. So yeah, there's an awful lot of activity, but it won't be Formula One activity necessarily. That said, of course, the reportage will continue. I was fortunate enough to be invited to the FIA exclusively 2 weeks ago. I went and visited the technical center. I visited the Geneva headquarters. I was shown around the remote operations center, which commonly known as ROC, which effectively is a remote race control, race director setup. And so I'll be bringing an analysis of that visit.
I can't wait to see you in the nightclubs of Miami, Dieter. But moving on to what's happened between the last podcast and now, Michael, there's been a bit of a change over at McLaren, hasn't there?
Yeah, McLaren, who slipped back a little bit in 2022, and they've not had the happiest of starts to 2023 either. One of just two teams, along with AlphaTauri, yet to score a championship point. And technical director James Key is out. There's been a bit of a restructuring going on at McLaren. Three people are going to replace him, including the Frenchman David Sanchez, who is moving over from Ferrari. We talked about him joining briefly last week. He's on gardening leave, so he's not going to join until January 2024. But yeah, it's not been a very good start to the season for McLaren. They admitted even before the season had started, even in February, Zach Brown, the CEO, and Andrea Stella, the newly appointed team principal, of course, both saying that the MCL60 hadn't hit its development targets. James Key, I thought quite interesting, he didn't really feature very much either at the launch or the official test. So maybe there were rumblings behind the scenes there that maybe he was sort of already on his way out. But they had, I remember the start of last season, they had that brake problem at Bahrain. Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo finished well down the order. They only had one podium finish in 2022 after having had 5 in 2021, including that famous win at Monza with Daniel Ricciardo, their first win in 9 years. McLaren had been on something of an upward trajectory from about 2017 onwards when Zach Brown, they had a reshuffle. Zach Brown was moved to CEO. Andreas Seidel came in 2019. James Key himself came in 2019. And it seemed like they were on a bit of an upward trajectory. But since last year, that seems to have slowed down a little bit. They lost out to Alpine in the battle for 4th place last year in the Constructors. And as I said, they've not started this year very well. And unfortunately for James Key, he's paid for that with his job.
Yeah, no, he definitely has. That's really interesting about the Ferrari situation where they've brought over that personnel, but he can't go obviously till his garden leave is finished. Dieter, what news do you have on that McLaren situation? I know you're very close with the team over at Woking.
Well, I think it's a bit unfair to say I'm very close to the team. I mean, they're about 250 kilometers from me, but I do try and keep my fingertips on all the teams, actually. And I was talking to some people at McLaren late last week, and fundamentally, the way that, yes, the team has got off to a poor start. But if we take the two races in isolation, I think the first one to look at is in Bahrain. Obviously, they had a DNF for Oscar Piastri, and also Lando Norris had a bit of an issue there. However, when we look at the next race, which is Saudi, it was opening lap damage, etc. That scuppered both of them. Lando had an incident in qualifying. Oscar, of course, made it into Q3, which proves that the car's got some inherent speed. And then they just had the sort of opening lap racing incidents, which dropped him down the order. So it's not as bleak as it appears. And certainly those two races, I don't believe, would be the reason for the change. As we know, David Sanchez was appointed some time back. And I believe that what Zach Brown had done is had a look at the trend over 3 years and said, we're not really making progress. Yes, we know that our new wind tunnel is not on stream. Yes, we know that the CFD, the simulator stuff still isn't on stream. But fundamentally, the tools that we do have now should have us further up the grid. And above all, we should have a car that doesn't have various twitchy type of issues, which the McLaren does have. I spoke to James in Bahrain. He was saying that part of it was the floor regulation change, which had affected them more than others. Maybe so. Look, let's give James the benefit of the doubt. A very good engineer, very capable man. But I think that ultimately, from a chemistry perspective, possibly it just didn't gel internally. And, James has left the team. I wish him well for the future. I'm sure he will turn up somewhere. I'm sure he'll be doing some sterling work there. And let's see how soon McLaren can bring the wind tunnel, the CFD, and also the simulator on stream, and above all, what sort of input David Sanchez can deliver. I personally believe he will start before January. That is the target date, but in Formula One, negotiations go a long way towards shortening these sort of things.
It's interesting you mentioned the infrastructure there, Dieter. I remember Andreas Seidel, when he was still at McLaren, he sort of admitted that the team's infrastructure was lagging behind some of the rival teams. The new wind tunnel suffered from some delays. We're not expecting that to be online until sort of late this year, which one would think would be too late to affect the development of the 2024 car. So it could be 2025 before we start to see the effects of that wind tunnel, which is also the last year of their current Mercedes engine deal. So they might have a new supplier for the 2026 rule reset. So I'm sort of wondering, how long is it going to take for McLaren to get back to a stage where they're going to be competitive, where they're going to want to be in contention for winning races again?
Absolutely, Michael, and you make a very good point. 2025 is also the last year under the current regulations, and I think that's also important, because what it does do is it gives McLaren the opportunity of verifying the wind tunnel versus the CFD versus on-track performance, etc., ready for the 2026 car. I mean, let's not forget that fundamentally the current regulations have caught a lot of teams out. All we got to do is look just up the road to Brackley at Mercedes, and again at Mercedes we're talking sort of probably 25 before they're able to sort themselves out. If we have a look at the various teams, I believe that Formula One has never been as unsettled as it is at the moment. And it's very interesting to have a look at it, regardless of where you start. If you start at the top, you've got Red Bull. As we know, Dietrich Mateschitz passed away in October. There have been all sorts of reshuffles. There are constant rumors about AlphaTauri being sold, about Christian Horner possibly not remaining in the position much longer. I don't subscribe to that, but those are the rumors. That Helmut Marko may step back. We then look at Ferrari. I mean, a total mess at the moment, from what I'm hearing from sources. If we then go and have a look at Mercedes, who were third in the championship last year, we know that there's upheaval there. We look at Alpine. They've got Gasly coming in. Then we go to McLaren. We've just discussed that. We go and look at Sauber. They've got Andreas Seidel in, Fred Vasseur out. You then go and look at Aston Martin. About the only one that's sort of stable, believe it or not, ironically, is Haas. You've got Aston Martin. They're also, they've got Fernando Alonso come in. They've got Dan Fallows come in. We've got Sorry, we'll have to cut this out. Which one was 9? Oh, AlphaTauri we've discussed already, so let me start that again. Then we have AlphaTauri, we've already discussed them, and at Williams, we've got James Vowles coming in as team principal, and they don't have a technical director. So, from positions 1 through 10, all of them have had some form of upheaval or headwind.
And what's happening with McLaren, we hope that with the history, with the brand and how iconic they are, we hope they get back to where they're supposed to be. But moving on to other news, Michael, you mentioned before we started recording that Porsche will not be joining Formula One on the grid in 2026. What's your sort of thoughts around that? We thought they were going to join and now they're not.
Well, this all started last year. There were lots and lots of rumors, and we talked about this a lot on the podcast last year. We wrote about it a lot on the Racing News 365 website. They were very, very heavily linked with a partnership with Red Bull. Of course, Red Bull have their powertrains division there, but it seemed as if Porsche wanted a bit too much. Porsche, it was rumored they wanted 50% of Red Bull's F1 operation. Red Bull weren't willing to give that up. We know that Porsche themselves, they don't have the facility to build their own engine, so they needed to partner with a team who have the facility to do that. That would tie in perfectly with a partnership with Red Bull because they have that facility there. It contrasts a lot with Audi, the other one of the Volkswagen Group brands who we know will be joining Formula One. Audi have the facilities to make their own engine at their Neuburg facility in Germany. They are gradually buying into the Sauber operation, which is going to become the Audi factory team in 2026. So it seems that the only way really that Porsche might enter Formula One in 2026 is with some sort of rebadged Audi power unit. But yeah, Porsche, it's interesting. If you look at the history that Porsche has in F1, it's pretty checkered. The last time they were in Formula One was 1991, where they supplied a V12 engine to the Footwork Arrows team, which was a complete disaster. It was overweight, it was underpowered. The car was failing to qualify, was not finishing races, and they actually withdrew from that, just within half a season, in what was clearly a very chastening and very humiliating exercise for a brand as storied as Porsche is, because Porsche, 19 overall category wins in Le Mans. They're hugely successful in other forms of motorsport. Of course, they have categories like the Porsche Super Cup that runs in several different continents and supports the Formula One circus. So Porsche have a huge amount of history and heritage in motorsport, but not in Formula One. And now it appears as if the Porsche name is not going to be in Formula One once again for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, Michael, the whole thing about Porsche is very, very interesting, because when I read the reports last week that Porsche are not coming into Formula One, my first action was actually to check the date. And I was saying, whoa, but hold on, this isn't news, this is old. And if we have a look at the FIA 2026 power unit registration process, fundamentally teams had to register by the end of November. Originally it was actually end of October. Then it was pushed out by a month. Then it was pushed out by a few more days until early December. And Porsche had not registered at that point. And we ran the story that, in fact, there'd been a power unit working group meeting in mid-December where the teams that hadn't registered were not permitted into the room, including Ferrari, and Ferrari then quickly registered. Porsche didn't. So it was pretty obvious 3 months ago that Porsche were not going to be part of it, unless, as you say, there was a remote possibility, and I really stress remote, that they could run rebadged Audi engines. Now let's just think about the commercial implications of this. That if they had taken the Audi engines and beaten Audi, Audi wouldn't be happy because they've gone and bought an entire team, namely Sauber. Equally, if Audi beats Porsche, what does that look like in the marketplace, where the luxury brand within the VW constellation goes and beats the ultra sporting brand? So all in, none of this ever made any sense. It may have made sense as Red Bull and Porsche coming in together, rebadging the Red Bull power units as Porsche, Porsche providing input expertise, etc., and running it as a distinctly separate operation from Audi. But the minute they fell apart with Red Bull, the minute they didn't register, it made no sense whatsoever. And that's why I sort of got the feeling that this news story, so-called news story, that Porsche weren't going to be part of it, was dredging up the past for some reason.
And if we look at this from the Formula One point of view as well, assuming we have 10 teams in 2026, and we may have more than 10 teams, and I'm sure we'll come on to talking about that in just a moment or two. If we have 10 teams in 2026, it looks like we will have Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ford, Honda, Renault, and Audi all as power unit suppliers, 6 power unit suppliers for 10 teams. So from that point of view, that there isn't really a need for another one. We're not short of power unit suppliers for the next cycle of regulations.
And Cadillac coming in as a brand, of course, if they do come in with Andretti. So we would have had potentially 8 different brands, potentially 10 or 12, 11 or 12 teams. I mean, mathematically, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, I'm sorry, but I repeat what I said earlier on. When I saw the so-called news story that Porsche weren't coming in, I checked the date to see whether this wasn't maybe December 1 last year.
It seems like everyone and its mother decided to get into Formula One in 2026. In other more serious news, Nelson Piquet Dieter was fined for some of the comments he made against Lewis Hamilton.
Yes, and I think quite correctly so. I mean, on the one side, I subscribe to freedom of expression, etc. But equally, there is a thing called decency. And what Nelson did, in my opinion, went well beyond the indecent. And I'm very, very pleased that this action was brought against him. And I'm very pleased that they've made it stick. It is a substantial fine. It's a punitive fine. It's what you would call an exemplary fine. In other words, they're making an example of him. And I sincerely hope that it teaches people out there that regardless of your opinion about somebody, which you're entitled to hold, you have to do it within the bounds of decency.
It is, as a brown man in the Formula One space, it is great that he's getting this fine, and hopefully, more importantly than that, he gets an education that you can't say stuff like that in the public space. So, Dieter, appreciate your thoughts on that.
And equally, Balve, if I may say so, he is a 3-time world champion, and therefore he was one of the Formula One's iconic figures, and just that alone means that he should set a good example. And I don't believe he did that. So frankly, yes, I believe he got his due.
Yeah. So sticking on you, Dieter, you mentioned just before we started recording some upcoming features that are coming within the F1 world.
Yeah, absolutely. I did allude to it, actually. It was the visit I made to the FIA about 2 weeks ago, immediately after Bahrain, in fact. I got back Monday night, and on the Wednesday morning early, I flew to Geneva. Very, very kindly hosted by the FIA. I spent 2 days there. I went through the technical centre in Valerie, which is on the sort of French-Swiss border. So just across the road across the border from Geneva. And I spent the day there looking at both the technical center and the archive, which was absolutely fascinating stuff. Really, really fascinating. Records going back to 1904, all the famous or infamous scandals that we had in Formula One, the Lotus double chassis from 1988, the Spygate, you name it, whatever there was, they've got all the records there. And then the next day, I was fortunate enough to be shown around the remote operations center in Geneva itself, a massive bank of TV screens. They fully wired into all the stuff at the track. It's effectively the race control duplicated in Geneva on a remote basis, which will allow race control to get on with having a look at the immediate stuff, and they can then hand anything over to Geneva and say, right, we've got to look at the next lot of activities and whatever. Can you please analyze it and feed back to us? So, it is a step in the right direction. It will take time for it to bed in, but ultimately, it was very, very impressive to see that. And I'll be bringing an analysis of that rock, as they call it.
So, Dieter, you mentioned that the rock over in Geneva. So what's the difference between the race structure that we have during a weekend?
Okay, so basically, Balve, what we have at any Grand Prix is, first of all, you have the local organizer, which is the ASN. They supply the clerk of course, they supply the marshals, etc. The race director takes over control of the actual sporting activity, but he hands over or delegates to the clerk of course. So if there's a need for flags or whatever the case is, he'll tell the clerk of course, who'll then tell the marshal. So you have a proper, almost military structure. The race director, currently Niels Wittig, will have a look at it, and he'll take certain decisions which he'll delegate to the clerk of course, and they will then execute those decisions. When there is a perceived, and I say perceived infringement, because it is not the race director or the clerk of course's role to decide whether it's an infringement, all they do is they flag up an incident and say, we believe that there could be an infringement there, or wherever. They then hand that over to the stewards. The stewards can then ask for additional information from ROC, from the race director, the clerk of course, from the team, etc., and they will then look at it and take their decision. So it's almost as though the race director is the traffic officer on point duty, if I may call it that. If he sees somebody jumping a red light or whatever it is, they then write out a fine, but it's up to the magistrates or the judges to decide whether or not that was a traffic infringement or not. And the same applies here. The race director sees something that he thinks could be a breach. He hands that over to the stewards, who are the judges, and they then decide. So when I hear comments, particularly in Twitter world, etc., that the FIA imposed this and imposed that fine, it wasn't the FIA, it was the stewards. And the stewards are frankly as distinctly different from the race director as a judge is from a policeman.
It's always nice to hear the clarification between those different roles during a weekend. You mentioned it earlier, Dieter, that there's been lots of confusion, and I'm hearing it a lot in the social media world where people are not quite sure of what the roles are. So, Dieter, appreciate you sharing your sort of knowledge on that. It's almost hard to admit, but we've been speaking for the last 20 minutes or so. There is a race this weekend. Michael, you mentioned last week that Piastri's debut home Grand Prix, Australia. What's going on down there?
Well, we've got the Australian Grand Prix coming up, the third Grand Prix of the year. As I said, I'm very pleased about this one because it's one of the two Grand Prix that actually start in the middle of the day for me, whereas you guys will be getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning to watch it. So for once, it's at a nice time zone for me. I'm clinging on, Balve, to a crumb of comfort here because the last 4 editions of the Australian Grand Prix, the winner didn't go on to win the Drivers' Championship. Charles Leclerc last year, of course, for Ferrari. We didn't have an Australian Grand Prix in 2021 because of COVID. The 2020 race, of course, was cancelled just before first practice, the very first race to fall victim to COVID. Valtteri Bottas won in 2019, and then Sebastian Vettel won in 2018 and 2017. You actually have to go back to Nico Rosberg in 2016, the last time the World Championship winner of a given year won the Australian Grand Prix. So if 2023 looks like it's going to go the way it's going to go, we've had 2 Red Bull 1-2 finishes so far. I'm hoping we get a little bit of variety in Melbourne. And looking at the early weather forecast, it looks as if we might be due some rain on Friday and Saturday. And so rain during qualifying on Saturday could really shake things up. I remember in 2005 when we had the one-shot qualifying, and that really shook things up. And Giancarlo Fisichella was a very, no doubt, a very happy beneficiary of that as he strolled to his win from pole position. So, yeah, I'm hoping for a bit of rain on Saturday. Not sure if there's going to be any on Sunday, but anything to mix the order up at Albert Park is always good with me.
Well, they do call Melbourne the city of 4 seasons in a single day. And I was talking to Aaron Deckers, our colleague who's down there at the moment already this morning. And I said something to him about this particular 4-season thing. And he said, well, right now, man, it's 1 season in a day. He said it's raining nonstop. And he says it doesn't look likely to lift at all. And I believe it's pretty heavy rain as well. So let's hope that it doesn't over rain because Australia has been given to floods, etc. But equally, let's hope that we have just enough to really spice up the action. Equally, I always feel sorry for spectators. These guys go and spend $500-$600 and they sort of sit there all huddled up in raincoats and umbrellas and can hardly see anything. And we sit back at base and out in front of our television and we say, wow, wasn't that a fantastic race? And the poor guys who indirectly paid for it are sitting there drenched and huddled up and cold and freezing and whatever. So let's hope that it works out well for everybody, for the competitors, for the spectators, for the TV audiences, the people of Melbourne, people of Victoria, etc.
Yeah, let's hope for a great race. And we'll be back here on Racing News 365 next week with a post-race breakdown of the Australian Grand Prix. We'll see you then.